Hello everyone, today we talk about one of the greatest commander of the condottieri era, naturally pullulating with such figures, that, however, in Colleoni finds one of the greatest stars in this great firmament of late medieval Italian commanders. It's only last year that they made a big video about the condottieri. Schwerpunkt talked a lot about Italian communal warfare that is actually more important, especially than at least the earlier phase of condottieri warfare. Colleoni is at the peak of the later developments of mid to 15th century condottieri military, and in particular the one of Venice. I made a video about the Venetian army organization between the 14th and 15th century for the series of late medieval army organization across all of Europe, and some people were surprised to learn that Venice had actually the most advanced army of the era, together with the band of ordonnance of Charles the Bold. Well, Colleoni tops as a major character the particular condottieri relations with the Republic of Venice, with the terra firma state that was established to crush, essentially, at least to stem, as a baseline, Milanese power. Colleoni himself was not Milanese, but Lombard, and so there is here that sort of homogeneous, almost fratricide clash between the Italians that were quite politically divided at the time, albeit having, in fact, actually the strongest militaries, and this would generate, in fact, an enormous and paradoxical crisis during the Italian wars. They're also preparing some content on. All right, so I will not explain why we must talk more about condottieri. It was just essentially all these historiographical reasons why I think that, at least in pop culture, we have a fair, at least a sort of relatively recurrent representation of, at least in also properly published historiography, of condottieri warfare, while we don't study the Italian communal armies, especially between the 13th and 14th century. We're actually by far the most advanced, not just in Italian history, but likely medieval warfare altogether, not just even in Europe. And that therefore deserve probably the single most underrated and even probably the top militaries of the time. In any case, today we in fact look at a different era. And we talk about Colleoni as a whole, right? Recently I made a video about Braccio da Montone that was a military history proper. Here we'll look a bit at the condottieri. It's unavoidably a military history, but because that's what he, did for a living. However, there is something princely, something sort of clientary, political, Venice, the Milanese, and more that Colleoni very well incarnated as a whole, and sort of encapsulates all the paradoxes, ambiguities also of the condottieri era, that we also need a bit, however, to normalize when we look at how, especially from a military point of view, that they actually operate. And there's always a history developing that in their lifetime careers as military commanders, these men had contributed themselves to form, especially when you look at these big names. And by the way, here I inserted in the title the veritable thing. Colleoni is actually, it would be Colleoni, and in Italian, coglione means testicles, and the point is that in Bartolomeo's coat of arms, you can see exactly that attribute of virility, of loyalty, of courage, and more that his family had earned, as we will see also with a very interesting previous medieval history, because these were essentially aristocratic families with a great military past normally. Not entirely, think about the Sforzas that really were just peasants up to a couple of generations before, but there is also a very rich history of sort of a bit less known military service, and Schwerpunkt we could bring a bit more on the surface. I think this sort of coat of arms represents the man entire. So Bartolomeo Colleoni was born in Solza. It was a small fortified village, 20 kilometers northeast of Bergamo, thus in what by medieval to modern continuity it was the so-called comitatum, the contado, and therefore coming properly from Bergamo as a whole. We talked about the sort of many Italian communes, we've seen how differently from certain parts, for example, of France or Germany, in Italy, literally every single community is tied to the city as a whole. And so when you look at this origins of Colleoni, you realize that this aristocracy was unavoidably tied to the city, although they normally had, as they did, possessions in the countryside, mainly fortified estates in this case. In fact, Colleoni was born within the castle that carried his family name. It was actually just a modest 14th century tower house still standing, positioned on the small but strategically vital Bergamasque shore of the Adda River. This river formed the natural frontier between the Duchy of Milan and the future Venetian terraferma mainland state during a period that primary sources date essentially to the 1395, 1400s, talking when Colleoni was born, right? Because Venice was yet to take off in the late 14th century in its terra firma built-up that reached, again, few tens of kilometers from Milan, including Bergamo, as a matter of fact. In fact, Milan is also very close to the city. We haven't covered Bergamo in the Italian communal series, but we will talk more about Lombardy. There is plenty of other cities from this region as well in a playlist if you're interested in that. Now, the uncertainty regarding Colleoni's date of birth stems from conflicting contemporary records. A bronze plate discovered in his tomb on November the 21st, 1969, during restoration work in the Cappella Colleoni, so his private mausoleum, very famous, I inserted also some of the pictures here, attached to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Bergamo's upper city, because Bergamo lays in the Prealps, and so the city actually develops like, I don't know, there are the centers famously as cities, there's the upper city and the lower city, that are not quite simply the citadel and the boroughs. Like it's something more constructed in the heavily urbanized, fortified Italian landscape. And today is Piazza Duomo, by the way. And so Colleoni, by the way, as far as the Bergamasque legacy is the celebrity of the city. And so in Bergamo, this plaque we were talking about explicitly states that Colleoni died at the age of 80, which is not bad at all, especially considering his gigantic as glorious military career. And since we know that he died precisely on November the 3rd, 1475, this inscription logically points to 1395 as the year of birth. In contrast, the biography composed by Antonio Cornazzano, it was a humanist poet from Piacenza in Emilia, born roughly in the 1430s. We don't know even his date of birth. It was not so important to medievals when you were born, but when you died, for obvious reasons, Christianly speaking. But aside from that, this Cornazzano had lived properly at Colleoni's court from roughly the mid-1460s, and most famously wrote the official biography of the condottiero, the Vita Bartolomeo Colleoni in Latin, a work directly commissioned by Colleoni himself, and thus reflecting the condottiero's own preferences, assigning the birth to the year 1400. Again, it's not so important, but it's a note of color in the general humanistic background, the fact that this condottieri had veritable courts that were essentially sub-enfeoffed in some areas controlled, in this case by Venice, that had some sort of more autonomous management compared to the sort of more tendentially monarchic Milan, the arch enemy here. So the later date, 1400, aligns with a widespread, albeit erroneous, belief that that year, 1400, marked a jubilee year. So the real Roman Jubilee was proclaimed for 1450, imbued with millenarian expectations and reinforced by the contemporaneous surge of the Bianchi devotional movement. This was we will see it also in our series about Christian history, huge penitential movement of white-robed pilgrims that crossed northern Italy in the summer and autumn of 1399, preaching peace and repentance. You know, these are a bit dark times after the mid-14th century crisis. Actually, things are sort of rising again, but society was very different from one of the beginning of the century. Made tons of videos about this. And in general, this is also, we've seen it with Braccio, that is naturally older, but more or less is fighting. It is already famous at this point. Like this pretty also politically unstable, in fact, military hyperactive peninsular condition. And this movement, the Bianchis, the Whites essentially, so swept through northern Italy, emphasizing the penitence and renewal. Colleoni, ever attentive to the construction of his public image, likely favored this symbolically charged year to enhance the heroic narrative of his origins. Nevertheless, indirect evidence from legal and patrimonial documents of the period, such essentially notarial acts, but also other, literary, narrative sources preserved in the Bergamo and Milan state archives, tends to corroborate a birth prior to 1400, rendering the plague's testimony the more probable chronology, which evidently also aligned with Colleoni, regardless of the vita, right, to have in his own tomb. Though, again, absolute precision remains elusive for how much we can be concerned. Now, the Colleoni lineage traced its roots to Lombard ancestry and formed part of Bergamo's urban nobility. We described in other videos how the Italian communes, regardless of their, at some point, popular, republican, some say even mercantile background, they were actually fully fledged city-states with, especially in Lombardy, a particularly heavy sort of nobiliar, aristocratic, and even properly knightly background. You would say in Lombardy, how? This is the land of the Lombard League. It's mostly infantry, right? Not quite, right? There is a pretty uniform development. Tuscany is a bit more popular in nature. So when you look at these, how they called them at the time, the great lords of Lombardy, like there was the sense that, in fact, in Lombardy, never a popular faction ever ruled, like except that there is the Ambrosian Republic, which is as you know, a small episode during the succession from the Visconti to the Sforza, that in fact does not change the broader picture. The Colleoni were a Guelph family belonging to the Credenza of Sant'Alessandro, one of the two main political factions in medieval Bergamo. The Credenza, the credences, were essentially some societies, some sworn communities devoted to the particular Saint Alexander in this case, that in fact were much tied with these kind of still nobiliar warband company, whatever you want to call it, masnata mentality. Colleoni's status is underscored by its heraldic device, which functioned as an arme parlant, graphically punning on the family surname, specifically 3 testicles, right? Because, of course, 3 is better than 2. From the dialect word Colleoni, we said before, and so even in Italian, this word was a bit gentle by alleviating the strict likeness with a vulgar title, but it was an heraldic one, right? And so actually a very strongly display one. That's many heraldry displays, erection, testicle. It's a thing. It shows virility, power, life, etc. The arms are now still visible on medieval seals and on the facade of the same Colleoni chapel. Interestingly enough. So archival traces of the clan extend back to the latter half of the 11th century, right? We're a bit in the realm of, not of legend, but something that at some point can be connected with broader clan, properly extended clanic figures, commencing with Gisalbertus Attonis, son of the notary Atto, who descended from a cadet branch of the prominent Suardi family that were actually the leading Ghibelline clan in Bergamo, rivals of the Colleoni. And this is very interesting because Suardi connection positioned the Colleoni within the emergent so-called gens nova, so the actually the third estate, and or at least what could be identified given the mostly essentially democratic in nature, especially also of the Italian knighthood at the time, because there was actual feudal nobility tied to the Holy Roman Empire, and we've seen that Lombardy in particular, again, regardless of the later clash of the Lombard League, but actually also, and especially for this, was nurtured properly within as the center of the same Italic kingdom, not just from Lombard times, that also many of these noblemen descended from, but properly the sense of the state, the Italic kingdom, what the German emperors mostly tried to control in different ways. We've looked at very interesting stories of these knights that established the consular commune, also in the case of Cremona, Zanen della Balla, all these figures that really show this sort of pretty stern and sort of brutal military background of this emerging also elements were co-opted by still an open knighthood at the time, the milites, that formed the consular regime as well. And in this sense, what you're seeing, especially at that age with the birth of the communes, is the actual waning of feudal aristocracy as a system rather than as an actual power that was transferred to the communal establishment. Giselbert, that we've seen before, acknowledged as the effective progenitor of the Colleoni line, first appears in records bearing the cognomen Colleone, a variant that would evolve in the standardized form. By 1117, he served as consul of Bergamo, a role that immersed him in the city's governance amid its transition from the comital to communal authority, better the communal authority on behalf also of the bishop and other public powers over the comitatus. His activities encompassed extensive land purchases, exchanges, and involvement in bracania, that is the medieval practice of pawnbroking and money lending. It was extremely typical also of the Italian military clans, which reinvested all this money also in specialized crops, like further fortification of the city space with the house towers and all this sort of medieval skyscrapers. And thus, this man was also classified, this thing could overlap among the so-called negoziatores, that is to say the mercantile elite driving, in the moment, economic transformation, but not all. Now, the Colleoni's political orientation remained predominantly Ghibelline throughout the 13th century, aligning with imperial interests against papal Guelph factions, but by the 14th century, this allegiance grew opportunistic. We've seen it with, for example, Ezzelino da Romano, that was born as a Guelph, but became the best man of Frederick II in northeastern Italy. And so at this point, also the Colleoni shifted allegiance to maximize advantages in Bergamo's fractious internal politics. Alongside the interrelated yet often rival Suardi, the Colleoni monopolized public offices and ecclesiastical dignities. They provided numerous canons to the chapter of Sant'Alessandra and held the hereditary captaincy of the city gate of the same saint, though their influence remained confined to the Bergamasque sphere, until Bartolomeo's career later on propelled the name of Bergamo to pan-Italian and international prominence. The origin of the family is important because, as I was saying, it's not like these condottieri sprang out as mushrooms from nowhere. It's important to understand their allegiance, their identity, their culture, the status, right? It could be varied, but obviously when you look at especially the later decades of the 14th century, you know that from a moment, say from the 1330s, where essentially the very majority of the mercenary companies had been foreign, mostly German. In that later phase, there is a almost complete Italianization of the world, and this started from the cooptation of local fighters, essentially, and the further sort of consolidation, more statal and also the sense strategic powers in the peninsula. The Colleoni's real estate portfolio expanded significantly. In the 13th century was a moment of tumultuous growth, in particular, among the Italian city-states after the departure of Frederick II. So the Colleoni's possessions spanned the Brembo Valley, that is northwest of Bergamo, rich in timber and iron mines. Longbows were actually produced in these areas, and sold to England, right? Interestingly enough, because the sort of the specific thermic balance and excursion across time conferred the local timber very good, like expandable, resistant, but also elastic characteristics that were great for longbows. Also, the so-called Bergamasque Isle, that is fertile triangular plain delimited by the Brembo and Adda rivers, whose strategic centrality amplified its military and political value. In fact, this would actually turn the main invasion route between Milan and Venice, and the understanding Colleoni's timeline, how and why also this guy became so important to an extent. Now, key holdings of the Colleoni family included the castrum of Baccanello at Calusco. This was destroyed in 1298 during the Guelph-Ghibelline Wars. This kind of castles were present in the hundreds, even in these communal districts like Bergamos that were just a few hundreds of square kilometers, right? Imagine, something completely unthinkable if you realize how eventually Europe was swept by, artillery to reduce basically these structures to nothingness. In fact, we don't see it, but the entirety of Europe was really like this, and Italian per capita wealth, demographic concentration made it like an incredibly thick net of fortresses. So you understand how the Colleoni played in all this game. Again, there were somehow minor factions. When you look at the history of those years, you have normally in these communes that are still not governed by a single lord, like essentially tens of different clans' names, right? We've seen it for the Medici, for example, where not nobody in, say, by the same time, but we're still there, and nobody could have imagined how they would have risen to sole power much later. The same goes for Colleoni, his figure at least. Baccanello at Calusco was a fortified site of considerable defensive importance until its destruction. Really, between these clans, these feuds, and the Bergamasque era is not overwhelmingly documented, because Bergamo is a sort of B-series commune, at least the more time goes on, and therefore we don't know all what we would like to, but it's still relevant that we have, in fact, the Colleoni already named. Relations with the Bergamasque church were intimate and long-standing. As early as 1126, we can't talk here in more vernacular terms, Gisalberto and Pietro del Brolo, provost of the collegiate church of St. Alexander, the old cathedral of Bergamo, that is now St. Vincent, jointly acquired properties, initiating a pattern of collaboration that persisted across generations. Imperial favor further bolstered the Colleoni's standing. In 1224, the Saint Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, I recently made a video about the Bamberger Reiter, as a matter of fact. Also, Lombardy had lots of those equestrian statues, and as you know, Lombardy was very tied with Swabia, in particularly probably in imperial sense. I mean, if you look at the list of cities that owed regular tribute to Frederick Barbarossa, basically you had Swabia, part of Franconia, and Lombardy. Like even the sense that another part like Bavaria or Thuringia was sort of closer to Swabia than Lombardy is sort of debated, political terms, obviously. And the same Stupor Mundi, in fact, confirmed to Zozzon de Colleoni and his descendants a feudal grant conferring appellate jurisdiction over all civil and criminal causes, with Bergamo and its contiguous territory privilege that entrenched the Colleoni's quasi-seigneurial authority. Because being conferred by the Holy Roman Emperor, essentially so with a public and feudal authority at the same time, the prerogative of higher and lower justice meant that you were basically an enormously powerful individual. And this meant also, as you know, if you had justice in your hand, that lots of wealth would come your way. This was the ultimate deal, also with the imperial function in Italy, in Germany, and so on. We've covered it very often. And so this patrimonial consolidation reached its zenith under Paolo Colleoni, that was Bartolomeo's father, who, in concert with several cousins, executed a daring coup on October the 23rd, 1404, thus when Bartolomeo was just a kid, by seizing the castle, the famous castle of Trezzo, on the Adda river. This was an incredibly important strategic fortress. Visconti held one. By the way, I also recently made a video about Gian Galeazzo. So if you look, it had an older military history, but this remained, in fact, some of the most crucial parts of the frontier of Visconti dominion. This fortress had a 72-meter high bridge tower over the Adda, right? So a commanding position, still the tallest surviving medieval tower in Lombardy to this day. Naturally, there were taller ones, but still, like, it sort of speaks of how about the military architecture of the very era, which is sort of difficult to find intact. Now, perched on the Milanese bank near the confluence of the Adda and Brembo rivers, Trezzo had been erected by Bernabo Visconti, who had been Lord of Milan in 1354 to 85, as a bulwark controlling ducal access routes. Right. I remember the duchy was properly a creation of Gian Galeazzo through the Holy Roman Emperor that elevated properly Milan as such a commanding an entire duchy and one of the largest powers, in fact, at the time in the Holy Roman Empire. This fortress later served as Bernabo's prison following his deposition, probable assassination in 1385. We'll talk about Bernabo. It has a very interesting also military history. As we've seen at the hands of his nephew, Gian Galeazzo, Visconti aided by Jacopo dal Verme, that was another famous condottiero of the year. Paolo's occupation transformed Trezzo into the nucleus of a semi-autonomous lordship of the Colleoni that conducted raids into surrounding territories and successfully repelled pressures from the Visconti regency under Caterina, who was regent for her minor son Giovanni Maria, 1402-1412, and the nascent Malatesta Signory in Brescia. That was the greatest rival, let's say, in provincial sense of Bergamo, almost twin, but in this sense, sort of rival cities. We're talking the time of Pandolfo III, Malatesta, who ruled the city between 1404 and 1421. We're in the very heart of the condottiero era, so lots of this kind of settlement. The Malatesta came from the Romagnol area, so they didn't have much to do with Lombardy, but they, through marriage, through political ties and so on, very, good military service, and they would gain this stuff. And Bartolomeo Colleoni is also a bit like the top guy in this dynamic. Now, it's very interesting, by the way, that the Colleoni had probably an ego capable of challenging one, again, of the single most powerful polities in Europe. All right, you are, again, literally few tens of kilometers from Milan, and you're defying the Visconti Signory at large. This is naturally, it's not like they were just holding out alone without a context. Again, the Visconti had sort of greater problems to think about than the Colleoni. But as you've seen, especially the capture of Trezzo on the Adda River, was a major feat because it conferred the owner like this massive strategic advantage very close to the Milanese heartland. The venture's success, however, bred also fatal discord, predictably. Paolo's own kinsmen, resentful of his intent to distribute authority equitably among participants, murdered him, beheaded in the castle courtyard around 1407-1408 to monopolize control. Just imagine this family history as a son. Apologetic narratives, particularly Cornazzano's, obviously, so Bartolomeo himself embellished this episode to magnify the later condottiero's subsequent rise from purported destitution, claiming that Riccadonna Saiguini de Vavassori, that was Bartolomeo's mother from another old Bergamasque noble family from the name, it's all a program. Riccadonna means rich woman. Saiguini sounds like very much tied to blood, and the Vavassori means of the Valvassors, the sub-vassals that were especially in the hierarchical order of the Lombard nobility, still technically theoretically properly imperial vassals, sub-vassals. And so both her and her son were imprisoned after Paolo had been murdered. And as a consequence, they also lost their resources. This was completely normal. If you lost this in this clanic feud, your possessions were normally confiscated, occupied, etc. Archival acts of property disposition contradict this, however, demonstrating sustained family wealth, so at least they didn't lose everything, nor possibly even the majority of their part, but naturally it was a very dangerous position to live in. Leadership at Trezzo devolved upon two principal branches. Giovanni, son of Guardinus de Collionibus, as we have in Latin Vus, documentary precedence suggests primacy, and Paolo, that was son of Guidotus de Collionibus. Interbranch rivalry almost certainly precipitated the fratricide between the two, though the exact circumstances remain obscured by the era's political turbulence, marked by the regency of the aforementioned Caterina Visconti during Giovanni Maria Visconti's minority, and by the retrospective myth-making that enveloped Bartolomeo's early life, as a matter of fact. It's completely normal, especially at this point in history, that these families, as you know, as condottieri, were not merely like citizens and magistrates and historians of, say, the early communal era. All right, so their life is sort of worse documented because there's kind of a more courtly literature. Never think, in fact, that simply we are necessarily better documented as time goes on. I mean, tendentially, yes, but it really depends also on the civilizational context, on the cultural background and society, etc. Besides, Lombardy also lost, unfortunately, the Milanese archives, and it was also a massive tragedy of the like of the destruction of the Neapolitan archive during World War II. In any case, the Colleoni retained Trezzo until January 2nd, 1417, when Francesco Bussone, a great name, we will have to make a video about him, known in fact more famously as Carmagnola, former cowherd turned general, in this case, Captain General Venice between 1426 and 1432, and pretty unreliable, unloyal, at least executed. There is an enormous debate behind this, but in any case, that's the bottom line. On May the 5th, 1432, recaptured Trezzo from the Colleoni for Milan, and granting honorable capitulation terms, by the way, and substantial indemnity as well to those who are occupied. So this was sort of, sorry guys, Milan needs it back, nothing personal. This loss framed the adolescent Bartolomeo's entry into a military vocation. Imagine, again, this background, the humiliation, the revenge, the sense of, status, this craft of arms. A vocation that would really span 65 years, from approximately 1410 to 1475. So as he was just a kid, again, reaching majority for the time. As you've seen also, Braccio started very young, so this was completely normal. It was just in the European aristocracy of the era to be quite quickly instructed in the feats of arms, starting with, smaller contingents and then rising. In any case of Colleoni, really controlling the most powerful army in Italy, namely the Venetian one. And as many other condottieri, Bartolomeo served across the peninsula, Naples, Venice, of course, but also Milan, obviously. Now, again, he was a native Lombard, and he was just sort of into the fray of this major political game. The family surname, documented as Colleus or Colleoni since 1123, as we've seen, derived directly from the canting arms, parted per fess, argent, and gules. 3 pairs of testicles counterchange, 2 white on red in sheath, 1 red on white in base. And so this is what he will go to battle with, will decorate the facade of his family chapel and appear on many of his castles as well. So probably a sign of defiance and cockiness, or boldness, if you prefer. Bartolomeo embraced this device with unapologetic pride, in fact, employing the battle cry "Coglia, Coglia" as well, which at least was his surname anyway, and inscribing it even on the sarcophagus of his beloved daughter Medea. Right, as she passed away, So even just think about, we'll look at his biography here and think about what it meant, just like in terms of pressure from everything in your life to be who you're going to become, being remembered for in the annals of military history. Later augmentations incorporated, because his coat of arms really changed, and I inserted here, in fact, also the variations. Golden lilies on azure from René of Anjou. This was the titular king of Naples. I have a bit about the Angevin kingdom of Naples. We'll have something more incoming on southern Italy, because we really haven't done much to begin with. That dates to 1467, by the way. And also bands goes on or from Charles the Bold of Burgundy, right? As you know, ruling 1467, 1477. This happened in 1473. I have also a second part of Burgundian military history that to cover from a recent video that looks at one from the beginning. Yet the original charges persisted as well in all this. So you understand how important this guy was. I mean, some of the most powerful polities and rulers of the era recognized his valor, right, and augmented his already loaded coat of arms. Now, speculation regarding personal polyarchism, which is something here suggests, maybe just by the coat of arms, possession of a supernumerary testis obviously belongs to post-mortem legend, and it's just a hyperbole for saying how much balls he actually had. The arms pre-existed Bartolomeo, by the way. This was just like the family ensign, appearing, in fact, for example, on the 14th century Milanese tomb of Margherita Colleoni, daughter of Nicola and wife of Gian Giacomo Trivulzio. It was yet another interesting figure in the condottieri era. These are all names that at some point we will cover, because again, now on Schwerpunkt, especially with this biographical series, we can and must really cover lots of this kind of figures. So let's start probably with Colleoni's military career, because that's what we're also more interested in. At some point we could do also something a bit more in depth, because proper military biography, but here we just look at the man. His martial apprenticeship began at age 14 or 15 as squire to Filippo Arcelli, that was the Lord of Piacenza. There was a connection with Cornazzani to a degree. This guy was an independent lord. Technically, this was within the Milanese sphere of influence, but still Milan ruled these various cities that remained, namely independent within the Holy Roman Empire. Right? It was mostly like accepting the signory of Milan. This guy was an independent lord from 1412 to 1441, so a pretty long time. By 1424, Colleoni commanded a squadron of 20 horsemen under Jacopo Caldoro. You see how they started with sort of small container, because there was properly all a stage, like a ladder to climb. Jacopo Caldoro at the time, we've seen it also in the video about Braccio, was the most successful captain, at least in southern Italy, after Braccio da Montone's own death, and a preeminent condottiero in the pay of the time of Queen Joanna II of Naples, ruled from 1414 to 1435. That year, Colleoni thus participated in the famous War of L'Aquila, 1423-1424, that is the demise of Braccio, where Caldoro's forces, in fact, decisively crushed and slew the same da Montone, was mortally wounded on June 2nd, 1424, and died a couple of days later. Braccio had really been the era's most feared captain. We've seen it all. Probably the idea of terror, this man, a bit of a black knight in his own regard, but one of the greatest leaders of his era. And that video tells pretty graphic detail how he earned that fearsome reputation. Now, from 1428 to 1430, Colleoni excelled during the protracted siege of Bologna. This was a papal city that had rebelled against Pope Martin V, where 1429-1430. In that occasion, Colleoni conducted, which is the technical term for the condotta, under Caldoro's banner on behalf of Pope Martin V, in fact, against the same papal city's rebellious populace and Milanese interference. The bigger picture now for each action is not necessary to draw, because at the end of the day, Colleoni was not in charge yet. But you understand, we've seen it in other videos. I also recently made a video about medieval Bologna. What the general picture was the contrast between the greatest power in northern in Italy to begin with, and the attempt, in fact, to hegemonize, to control some parts of central Italy, to effectively extend control on the whole peninsula, which the Milanese had almost succeeded at some point in doing. I also made multiple videos. I talked about the Battle of Molinella, the Battle of Caravaggio, that all illustrate a bit like the strategic picture. There were some moments in which Venice and Milan, because Venice came along at this point as a terra firma continental power against its maritime vocation, exactly to stem Milan. They had already tried this, say, first, stepping out of their lagoons in a more permanent fashion since the 1330s. Of course, they had been fighting on the continent many times already, but creating literally an alter state to counter Milan. And there are certain specific battles in Italy. They were also pretty big, as a matter of fact, and we hardly ever discuss that would have witnessed, in case of different outcome, either a Milanese or a Venetian hegemony over the peninsula. Naturally, of course, when a side becomes too powerful, there is a resistance. This was the classical picture in many of the politically fragmented countries like Italy, Germany, and so on. But we're talking also pretty efficient, pretty advanced armies as well. So it's something that could tendentially give rise to a more consistent, also national, at least if we're talking central northern Italy, peninsular power. Now, Colleoni's growing renown in these actions attracted Venetian attention. Right? And Venice naturally had money to spend for the best commanders. This inaugurated really a complex, enduring association that oscillated between mutual dependence and suspicion under such circumstances that, however, ultimately bestowed upon Colleoni unparalleled wealth, territorial aggrandizement, and a lifelong captaincy general. In fact, Colleoni was the only condottiero to ever receive this title for life by the Venetian Republic this happened in 1455. Right? This is particularly important because Venice, at some point we'll talk this better in Venetian politics and administration. They had created this terra firma state from scratch. They had partially succeeded so swiftly because they hadn't been so sort of politically iron-fisted against local autonomies. They will become later as they grew way more powerful, but they were also exploiting the fear of the Milanese, and so brokering this sort of allegiance of the local communities. Milan, conversely, had a much older history of Lombard leagues link up in the western central Po Valley that really consolidated something way more statally compact, but not necessarily, in fact, capable of dislodging the same Venetians from the east, and always living with this sort of threat next door at some point, a few tens of kilometers from the same Milan. And the way the Venetians consolidated this territory further was, in practice, starting to involve, in fact, to subcontract with the local possessions to some condottieri and or their so-called later also lance spezzate, broken lances. So when a condottiero died, say, and by this point the mercenary companies were becoming some regional armies on their own, the ones that in fact would align with the Venetian. But it's we haven't talked. I discussed this in the video about the condottieri, but you know how this mechanism worked. That basically the mercenaries became the professional element. This was really the case for most of Europe de facto. When you look at the salaried troops, men at arms, that's the backbone of everything in Western Europe. And these men were Italian anyway, so they weren't quite foreign at that point. They could be easily integrated within these possessions, provided all this connection of loyalty, of general interest, and of course you had to provide them with enough estates if you really wanted them to be loyal. Right? They were businessmen of war, so there was. It's a bit of a myth that Machiavelli made up, in a sense that the condottieri's battles were allegedly bloodless. Actually, we've seen that they were pretty darn bloody, as a matter of fact. But there was a sort of business character to these companies that naturally fell on the responsibility not much of the state as a whole, that also, yes, depended on them, but in fact on these guys to maintain intact as well. And so there is a very interesting dynamic happening here. Now, the reasons why this state of things started happening in Italy and became sort of defining factor, especially of the later condottieri era, because otherwise, up to that point, the ways the states had used their armored forces was pretty sort of conventional, so to say. It doesn't matter how advanced, but fit the rest of Western Europe. It's something we'll discuss again in another video, but bear in mind that is notoriously also the dynamic. Now, in 1431, Colleoni entered Venetian service as lieutenant to the aforementioned Carmagnola amid renewed hostilities with Milan. The Third Milanese-Venetian War, more specifically, 1426-1454, so actually multiple wars at a time, many campaigns between the two major powers in the north. On October the 17th, 1431, Colleoni led a vigorous assault on Cremona, that I mentioned before, a key Milanese city fortress on the Po River, which were in the heartland of Lombardy, which foundered due to Carmagnola's suspiciously delayed reinforcement. An inaction that fueled treason charges and culminated in the aforementioned Carmagnola's execution in Venice on May the 5th, 1432. Carmagnola, tragic figure, but also very famous condottiero, and again, expressing all the tension, the drama of that year. Colleoni's conspicuous bravery earned commendation, an augmented command of 80 horsemen at that point. So it wasn't yet the commander will become later, but he's rising up through the ranks. 80 horsemen that were to be sustained by the fief of Bottanuco. That is a village on the Adda River, so close to his home, that now the Venetians controlled, and still bearing in fact his name in local toponymy, right? As this initial recompense from the Serenissima, and therefore uniting with Colleoni's possessions in here. Venetian policy, wary of condottieri cultivating personal cults, withheld the supreme command despite Colleoni's manifest competence already at that point. The captaincy general passed to Gianfrancesco Gonzaga. I made a video about him. It was one of the very first videos I made on Schwerpunkt, and this guy is very important because he is the first head of state to become a condottiere. Up to that point, head of states did not sell their own service as not their own state, but de facto almost, because they aligned themselves thus also with their resources, with this or that power. They had been mostly mercenaries, free companies that were hired by a state, right? Here it's different. It's a comparticipation in that regard, and this was due to the general location of the Gonzaga Mantuan state. I also have actually a video on the original series about the House of Gonzaga. It was literally Mantua is in the in the southeasternmost corner of Lombardy, right? Is a city fortress among riverways, very central between Venice and Milan, and therefore was the tip of the balance on many occasions in the struggle between the two. Gianfrancesco Gonzaga was Marquis of Mantua between 1433 and 1444. Right. We know, by the way, through these years that Colleoni demonstrated to the Venetians mastery of Alpine warfare. This, for example, happened in the 1432 Valtellina campaign. This valley links essentially Lombardy and the Grisons. In 1433 in the Camunian Valley, that we also discussed in a recent video about Indo-European history. The Camunian cross, right, is very, that solar symbolism that is still paraded in the flag, in the banner of the modern Italian region of Lombardy. This place is essentially between Brescia and the Tonale Pass. And so here, Alpine warfare is very interesting. We really never ever talked about this because in general, like as we've learned also from the Funkrieg, mountain warfare is sort of secondary to an extent. But just thinking in medieval times, this immense nature of the Alps and how tough this warfare actually was. And Colleoni was born basically there, and he knew his deal on this ground. At the Battle of the Lebbio, fought between November the 18th and the 19th, 1432, under the Venetian Provveditore Giorgio Corner, the Venetian arms suffered a reversal at the hands of Niccolò Piccinino, one of the greatest captains of the age, who died in 1444. Colleoni was among the few captains to escape captivity on that occasion. The Peace of Ferrara, concluded in 1433 and signed, in fact, on April the 18th of the same year, provided a lull during which Colleoni withdrew to his Bergamasque estate and contracted marriage with Tisbe, daughter of Leonardo Martinengo, that was a leading Brescian noble family loyal to Venice, because Bergamo is closer to Milan and Brescia is in the east, so it had already been controlled by the Venetians. And that's interesting, again, because you have this frontier area, and even between the two rivals, these two clans marrying to one another. Colleoni's father-in-law was a distinguished Brescian nobleman and Venetian commander himself. This alliance fused two extensive consortia, meaning essentially some guilds, and nobiliar clans, amplifying Colleoni's socio-political radius to encompass Brescia, the Camunian Valley, and the Bergamasque Plain as well, as massive expanse. The couple, so-called Bartolomeo and Tibe, established residence at Martinengo, so the bride's family sort of ancestral site. This was a fortified town halfway between Bergamo and Brescia, by the way, so it had some almost Solomonic symbolism. In the so-called Casa del Capitano, the captain's house, a castellated structure integrated into the town's fortification and serving as administrative hub for a personal dominion that included, among the others, Urgnano, Romano di Lombardia, and the representational seat of Malpaga. This was a moated castle near Cavernagor built by the Saint Colleoni from 1456. Warfare reignited in 1437 under Gonzaga's nominal leadership, with Colleoni directing 300 lances. At this point, we're really looking at a provincial force in a subordinate yet critical capacity alongside Erasmo da Narni, called Gattamelata, a very famous condottiero, died in 1443, commemorated by Donatello's statue in Padua. That is, in fact, like very similar. I also made very early in Schwerpunkt history a video that describes these equestrian statues. That also, I mean, Colleoni is one being the most famous, being the first statue we'll see later from antiquity, right? From ancient times to have finally the horse, like probably technology allowing the horse to have one hoof raised, one. And so you see also the beauty, this incredibly physical, majestic kind of duo, almost a centaur, right? There is a lot of anthropological sort of traditional symbolism there. Also, Niccolò da Tolentino, another famous condottiero, died in 1435. In 1438, Colleoni mounted a tenacious defense of Bergamo against Piccinino's incursion, while Gonzaga effected a disorderly retreat beyond the Oglio River, marking the Venetian-Milanese border. The latter action aroused suspicion of collusion and prompted Gonzaga's defection to Visconti service, which is a huge deal for the aforementioned sort of Mantuan pawn in relation to these powers. Gattamelata assumed interim governorship, the Senate reserving full generalcy for Francesco Sforza, who became Duke of Milan in 1450, deemed vir strenus atque impiger rei militari. That same year, Brescia endured a grueling siege by the same Piccinino. It lasted 2 years, 3 almost, 1438-1440. Gattamelata orchestrated an audacious extrication on September the 24th, 1438, via unguarded mountain passes north of Lake Garda, the route through the Sabbia and Trompia valleys, an operation that Colleoni helped execute and later replicated in relief attempts with Sforza and Gattamelata. Contemporary masters credit him with 400 horsemen. The Peace of Cavriana in autumn 1441, signed November the 11th, precipitated a rupture with Venice in particular. A new style condotta accorded Colleoni 800 horsemen and 200 infantry wartime, scaled to 600 and 115 apiece, plus the feuds of Romano, Covo, and Antegnate, all villages in the lower Bergamasque. This is very interesting from an organizational point of view because you realize that 800 lengths is basically a battle line. And so it's really, a very important commission. At the same time, this guy has few infantry because essentially those would be normally provided by the communes under Venice, right? The so-called fanti provisionati that were essentially some militia. They were actually, especially in the Venetian Republic, pretty well equipped and mostly working as auxiliary forces, as was mostly the case for all of Europe at this point, also as pioneers. Also Venice was very resourceful in broader technological, logistical terms and so on. And the point being that without that infantry, at the end of the day, you couldn't make a coup. Obviously, Colleoni had he wanted, he could mobilize many infantrymen himself, but the mechanism here is that you are hired with the battle-winning arm of cavalry, that is the punch and most punching force in open field, but essentially you're provided by your employer all the necessary complement to wage a war. And without infantry, without also support of also heavier pieces, for example, artillery, you can't quite do everything by yourself, or at least it would be more difficult to attempt a coup or something. You understand how sort of cautious Venice rightfully is in general, because these men were incredibly ambitious. Again, if you understand these guys, it's not even about ego in sort of the idea that these people were always, like, there is the sense that all great commanders in history, all great leaders were just some pompous people who thought too much of themselves. But actually, these men really had cultivated that in order to have this lifestyle, these achievements, and so on. And they were really people who could inspire to much greater things. The Venetian proveditore, so the proveditore was this supervisor, or actually provider by etymology, which in fact furnished the aforementioned forces, but at discretion. So not much as a leader, yes, but not much as probably the most important military commander. And he oversaw also this other lands in the terra firma when things were, like in this case, also peaceful. This proveditore Gerardo Dandolo, this came from the Venetian aristocracy as well. Rigid enforcement of peacetime reductions, compounded by unpaid arrears, impelled Colleoni to depart upon contractual expiration. Right, things were not working very well. The guy was not very satisfied in this contract. Filippo Maria Visconti, Duke of Milan, 1412-1447, received at this point Colleoni enthusiastically, bestowing a Milanese palace at the Jovian Gate, the site of the future Castello Sforzesco. So some of the most sort of important areas, possessions in Milan, commanding 1,500 lances, which is more, as we've seen, that he had ever had, almost double the one he had received in Venetian service. Besides, Colleoni's wife Tisbe received from Filippo Maria Visconti the castle of Adorno in the Genoese Apennines in the south, across Emilia. This means a lot because the Duke of Milan is basically buying the best condottieri around. He sort of provides also the couple with lavish jewels, so he really wants to buy Colleoni, and he succeeds. Visconti service, however, proved fractious due to incessant friction with Piccinino, that was at this point in Milanese service Colleoni's nominal superior, dispatched in 1443 to levy taxes in the Aveto and Nure valleys. These were among the mountains south of Piacenza, so we're technically in the Apennine, between, again, those places where he received also possessions. They are Emilia, Liguria, and so on. Colleoni withdrew after 3 days amid heavy casualties. In 1446, accusations of Venetian correspondence that obviously existed, it's not like he cut all ties, and the Venetians wanted him back, led to Colleoni's imprisonment at the Monza's Forni. That would be the old ovens. This was actually a notorious prison inside the royal villa of Monza, that is just next door to Milan, basically. It's just like a almost twin city. From September 26th until Visconti's demise on August the 13th, 1447, which changes everything, because as you know, he was the last Visconti in the main line. This is forcible rise. And there is a major issue because of the aforementioned Ambrosian Republic, and so he, in this upheaval, Colleoni manages to escape his arrest. As we've seen, he literally lived next door. I mean, Bergamo was just a few tens of kilometers away. The important was to evade. And he rejoined his intact company at that point, because he had obviously some private force and next to also what the Venetians had paid him. And at Sforza's recommendation, he entered, interestingly enough, so he really was keeping himself abridged, the two powers, the Ambrosian Republic's pay. Right? This was this aforementioned Republican government of Milan, 1447, 1450. It's just like a meteor. It's not really that important. It's propedeutic, actually, also to the rise of Sforza later. And the reason why Sforza called Colleoni at that point to enter there, because he despised the Ambrosian government, like this popular establishment, but he had to comply initially with it, especially because, again, Colleoni in this sense had to counter the Orléans-led French invasion. That's a very interesting thing, that the French attempted multiple times to take Milan during actually the Middle Ages, not just succeeding during the Italian wars, but they also failed in part that point. So lots of interesting stories. As you know, the Visconti had married to the House of Orléans with French royalty. Complicated story now to digress on. What we're focused on is Colleoni. On October the 11th, 1447, at Bosco Marengo, near Alessandria, it's namely Lombardy, but it's at least in today's region of Piedmont, Colleoni executed a lightning envelopment that annihilated René de Resnay's cavalry, inflicting 1,500 fatalities and securing 14,000 crowns as ransom for the commander. Right, it's the distinguished French nobleman. In April 1449, Colleoni replicated this success at Romagnano Sesia and Borgo Manero, towns in the Sesia Valley, against Savoyard contingents allied to the Republic of Milan, eschewing protracted harassment for crushing massed charges. Right. So at this point, actually, the situation with the Ambrosian Republic is changing. We don't have, again, unfortunately, time to digress on all the political entanglements, but Colleoni is active in Lombardy, that is crossing a pretty turbulent moment. These triumphs catapulted Colleoni's international stature. That's when Charles the Bold, the Count of Charolais, at that point future Duke of Burgundy, actively courted Colleoni's own employment. right? How often have you heard this? This is normally, not a story you hear, but Colleoni was, again, that recognized internationally. On June the 15th, 1448, Colleoni contracted with Venice for 500 lances and 400 infantry, yet court intrigue orchestrated by Gentile da Leonessa. This was a Venetian. He was actually an Abruzzese, but at this point in Venetian service, he was a nobleman from central Italy, hostile to powerful condottieri. Was jealous, he feared to lose power as well. As such, Colleoni necessitated to fly to Sforza once again. Sforza that had now finally taken over Milan as the Golden Ambrosian Republic had capitulated. Naturally, Ambrosian stands for Milanese because of Saint Ambrose of Milan, the ancient Trier archbishop. We talked about him, of Theodosius, again, a key figure in late antique Christianity. So the Sforza have completely installed themselves, and as we've seen, there would obviously be some connection between the two. And in fact, the Milanese asked Colleoni for service in 1452, 1453, right? It's 1453. We looked at it in other videos, namely also what was happening in Papal Rome, but most obviously because of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. Clandestine negotiations facilitated by Tisbe and the Venetian patrician Andrea Morosini culminated in formal resignation to Sforza on February the 15th, 1453, and re-engaging Colleoni with Venice on April the 12th, 1454. Imagine, by the way, you are summoned by these powers who perfectly know that you're ready to pass from the other side if things, go. And they were as responsible as these guys because, as we've seen, at times they wouldn't pay them enough, at times they couldn't, even though they had other plans, they had to manage other affairs and promote other condottieri. Milanese invective decried Colleoni as the, quote, maggiore traditore che mai portasse corazza, which means literally the greatest traitor that ever wore a cuirass. Yet the accord's unprecedented terms negotiated by the Council of Ten stipulated 100,000 ducats annually to Colleoni. This is a princely salary, if there's such a thing, income. Prospective generalcy, by the way, upon vacancy, and conditional lordships of Como, Lodi, or the Ghiara d'Adda, that is the fertile plain between the Adda and the Po rivers. This is big because, Como and Lodi are also very sort of strategic, saying that they're fully fledged communes, and so this guy starts literally lording over some of them. This gives you an idea probably of the power of that. We will talk about Como and Lodi because they are, again, especially the former, I think it's the next Milanese commune that we're going to cover. Very strategic in the far north, controlling the access also, at least the Lombard access to Germany. The Peace of Lodi is really a watershed in Italian history. We made multiple videos on this agreement. It was formalized in April of 1454, the 9th of April in particular. It's actually establishing the Italian League of the greatest power of the peninsula, Milan, Venice, Florence, the papacy, and Naples, imposing peacetime constraints. This is the age of the equilibrium, right? This was created by Cosimo de' Medici for different reasons. I finished this year a series about the original series on Florence that required some sort of in-depth content. And this sense is of trying to essentially put an end to at least the greater bloodshed between the major Italian states, given especially the Milan, Venice, Florence triangle that since literally the early 14th century had brought this enormous struggle over probably the control of central northern Italy without actual accomplishments from either side, because Florence was more often than not allied with Venice, as long as Milan in particular was the greatest power. But this balance would, in a sense, basically acknowledge the fact that strategically the equilibrium was achievable. There would actually be wars in this period. We've also seen some battles fought in between, but the sense is that at least until the death of Lorenzo il Magnifico in 1492, that fateful year, among other things. I just recently made a video about the fall of Granada. In any case, I have also something on Columbus, and probably will make something about latter as well. Would essentially last. Really, it's just 2 years later, in 1494, Charles VIII entering Italy and proving to Europe that regardless of the great prestige, power, wealth of the Italian states, actually a major monarchic power like the recompacted French one after the 100 Years' War could actually enter virtually undisturbed the peninsula, so opening like a Pandora's box there. And what happened in the following generations. Now, Colleoni finds himself in this fight. It's an almost Cold War, almost, because they actually fought against one another. But imagine that in theory, like this balance between Italians has to be maintained. It's probably an Italic league that is meant also to defend the peninsula from, for example, the Ottoman Turks and or the French that at this point, at the very end of the 100 Years' War, the year before, like are actually the greatest problem there, as we've seen also later. So it's a very interesting period in history, especially if one wants to deepen the dynamics of this balance. We're probably going to do that, and in part we will see it now. Now, Colleoni at this point was provided with further grants. On August the 14th of 1454, he controlled Martinengo, Cologno, Alserio on the Serio River, and Urgnano. A November revision fixed peacetime provision at 60,000 ducats, with generalcy confirmed on March the 10th, 1455. Colleoni was ceremonially invested at Brescia on June the 24th. In 1456, he acquired the dilapidated castle of Malpaga, I was talking about before, in the commune of Cavernago, 12 kilometers from Bergamo, from, in fact, the same Bergamasque commune that sold it for 100 ducats. That was not even too much, transforming the place into a multifaceted complex of fortress, palace, and troop quarters that remained Colleoni's lifelong headquarters. Right, very interestingly. And Malpaga's castle is quite famous because its frescoed halls are visible like still today, and there are interesting sources also for the military of the year. If you think about this in Colleoni's perspective, it's also quite fascinating. Now, contract renewal in 1457 spanned 3 years of ferma. All right, in May 1458, Colleoni visited Venice officially for the Doge Pasquale Malipiero's accession. The Doge was elected on October the 15th. Colleoni lodged on the occasion at the Morosini Palace, receiving state honors from the Serenissima and presiding over equestrian tournaments in Piazza San Marco. A contemporaneous testament bequeathed the bulk of Colleoni's accumulating fortune to the Republic of Venice. So this was an important patrimonial choice and political direction, naturally mirroring the Colleoni's definitive alignment with Venice. Right, things could change, but still. Persistent ambition, however, manifested in deliberate contractual brevity, if anything, to preserve bargaining leverage. In 1460, amid renewal talks, Angevin overtures against Naples coincided with the deliberations. In 1462, Pius II, famous Pope, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, 1458-1464, proposed Colleoni commend a crusade against the Malatesta, in particular Sigismondo Pandolfo, the Lord of Rimini, because this was a rebellious Romagnol lord of the state, of the church, eliciting a 10,000 ducat pledge, but Venice retained Colleoni by conceding hereditary transmission of feuds in exchange. His military skills were really that prized. Offers to lead Venetian forces in Morea against the Ottomans in 1463-1464, because the Venetians had a garrison in the Peloponnese, were politely declined to prioritize Lombard security. This is interesting if you wonder what the Westerners were doing when the Ottomans were swarming across the Mediterranean. It's mostly that. However, consider that, as you know, Pius II is the guy of Uniati, of John of Capistrano, so we will talk about that. I have a video on Uniati's schedule, by the way, so it's fascinating to see how contemporaries were working like it. I also made a video about the Moran War, the one of the centuries later. But just for saying, again, a bit of Venetian military history all across the board. Francesco Sforza's death on March the 8th, 1466 prompted immediate mobilization because the routine Milanese political crisis due to the lack of some sort of proper succession mechanism were always a good chance to unseat the sword once again. Unsubstantiated rumors circulated of secret Venetian sanction for Colleoni to claim Milan personally, even. Galeazzo Maria Sforza's unopposed succession, however, diffused the crisis. By late summer 1466, Florentine anti-Medician exiles, led by Diotisalvi Neroni, the former gonfaloniere of Florence, and mediated by Ferrara's Borso d'Este, Marquise, between 1450 and 1471, recruited Colleoni to destabilize Piero de' Medici, aiming to fracture the Milan-Florence alliance and secure Venetian hegemony in the north. With the Molinella campaign and battle that I made an entire video on. Beautiful, and this is again one of the moments in which here basically you see there are some Florentine exiles that signed to open the gates of Tuscany at the end of the day. Venice issued a 40,000 ducat condotta in aspetto in February 1467, framing the enterprise as private yet furnishing logistical and diplomatic backing. It's a massive force. And in fact, Molinella is one of the greatest battles of the era in Europe to begin with. And again, when I say that, I say actually that the Italian communal period is less publicized. Well, imagine these battles that are not very sort of popular, but say were the largest, and even within the condottieri, we know that few in general, if you ask the rank and file guy, so to say. Now, Colleoni's army crossed from the north at the Po in early May 1467, swiftly occupying Bagnara and Mordano near Imola, the fortresses controlling the Emilian road. League forces under Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, 1444-1482, coalesced faster than anticipated, stalling progress while a pro-Medici coup in Florence failed. Reinforcements under Alessandro Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro, and Ercole d'Este, heir to Ferrara, shifted momentum toward Parma in Emilia. I made a video about medieval Parma, but Montefeltro compelled the battle at Riccardina, also called Molinella, July the 25th, 1467. This is the, as described in the video, the first major battle in Italy where field artillery played an important role. Like both sources of, say both sides of the sources on the battle claim that mobile field artillery in particular was employed for the first time. They attribute respectively to, in fact, Colleoni and Montefeltro this. We know that this stuff was already present, unsurprisingly, by that point all over Western Europe. So it may be, from an Italian perspective, true, but again, they probably didn't even care just per se. It is probable, however, that tactically speaking, this was, especially considering the size of the battle and so also the relative amount of firepower proportionally fielded, that was a great moment. It's an interesting battle. If you're interested, again, I have an entire video on it. It may be disappointing because the engagement ended inconclusively. And so it shows well what also a bit Western warfare had come to, especially after the mid-14th century crisis. These are more linear deployments, essentially what before were the battles in depth, now they are with the center and the wings. There's this peppering of the enemy formation, testing. There is a much greater reliance on ground, partially field fortifications. Here, like the battlefield itself is something like a marsh and with canals, etc. And in fact, the Italian, especially the Po Valley, you think it's a flatland. There's a lot of cavalry, right? But it's full of canals. And so infantry, and also this combined arms tactics with gunpowder, artillery, and so on. It starts becoming also something very, very fascinating. Colleoni deployed this light cannon on carts behind the parting front line. And in fact, it seems mostly that it was on Colleoni's side that this thing was used. In fact, they were the ones trying to break through, right? Montefeltro was from the other side, more defensively poised. By the way, it's a very interesting time in history where these guns were used, again, for the first time in ways that were even thought to be maybe unconventional, violating chivalric conventions, but really for the time, like this condottiero had seen it all. We've seen how sources can, it depends on the sources are, right? This condottiero surely would have not really thought of that. Like they weren't thinking this about flank attacks, I don't know, in the 13th century. But there was a model, it was an ideal or something bitterly evaluating the introduction of this fire. If you think about how the end of Jacques de Lalande, Chevalier Bayard, Giovanni dalle Bandiniere, all famous knights killed by these guns. We'll make all videos about them. I am preparing something for all of them here. It's very important for the era because we have few about the very big end of the very beginning of the 15th century. The moment in warfare is actually very beautiful. Malaria, contracted amid Molinella's marshes, enfeebled Colleoni. Papal arbitration under Paul II, Pope between 1464 and 1471, proclaimed peace between the two sides in May 1468. Had Colleoni broken through at Molinella, again, likely would have seen Venice hegemonizing central northern Italy or something like that. But instead not. Equally at Caravaggio, something we also documented just by comparison. This peace omitted Colleoni's coveted crusade command, by the way, which he would have also just out of prestige and taken. But these are the same years of again all the issue like in Hungary, the Order of the Dragon, Hunyadi, Corvinus, etc. There were Italians there too. We have actually seen it also in the video about medieval Serbia. There's the famous Pippo Spano that had become a Hungarian oligarch amidst these turbulent times of the Turkic invasions of Central Europe. Standard Venetian service resumed for Colleoni via one-year condotta in October 1468. Animosity with Galeazzo Maria escalated at that point, and in 1469, Angevin prospects against Aragonese Naples conferred the style than the Gavian Golden Lilies on Azure to Colleoni. Right, there is a very interesting mechanism here. Basically, it's the same Milanese that at this point allow for the Aragonese takeover of Naples, because without Milan there would have not been a way to do so, and so the Angevins here side with Colleoni. What is interesting is how these dukes, like I don't know, the Duke of Milan, the Venetians had more of a republican government, but so they, if anything, just because they changed the head of state every once in a while in a non-dynastic fashion. But it's interesting because the Saint Colleoni was so appreciated, and there was this kind of, again, imperial feudal culture lingering, especially with the Milanese, and the fact that Colleoni was a Lombard himself. Okay, that makes everything very personal, right? A matter of international policy dictated by how you treat this or that guy at the top. There is a renewal of the condotta in 1470 that admits Colleoni to the Maggior Consiglio, the Great Council of Venice, a rare honor for a non-noble, right? And also a non-Venetian to an extent, I made a video about the Venetian reforms that had established the Maggior Consiglio for good as the most important organism of the the Venetian Republic to stay. The thing started in the mid 14th century with the War of Chioggia, the crisis against the Genoese, and if you're interested, you can look at that. It's just 30-40 years before Colleoni himself was born. There are also Ferrarese succession anxieties in 1471 that elicit Galeazzo's provocative challenge to single combat with 1,000 men per side for a Romagnol city in particular, or 100,000 ducats. There is an intensive papal and Neapolitan mediation averting confrontation at this point. In February 1473, Charles the Bold engaged Colleoni for 3 years at 150,000 ducats, 1,000 lances, and 1,500 infantry, augmenting his arms with Burgundian bands. And so here, probably, the Burgundians keep Colleoni for a while. This is very interesting because this inter-regional, international exchange is very often like we reason as this power was this power, and there was an intense exchange. In fact, there were actually many Italians together with the Englishmen, the Germans in the Burgundian ducal army at the time, and it's all that blended really. Venetian intransigents voided this pact by early 1474. In March, in Malpaga entertained even Christian I of Denmark, was king of the Nordic country from 1448 to 1481. Christian was en route to Rome, and he stopped by Malpaga, and so he met with Colleoni and everything. Colleoni's civic contributions were extensive, by the way. What strikes you about these leaders, they weren't merely military men. They had really governmental, artistic, really broader talent next to their genius and capacity. On February 19, 1466, Colleoni established the Luogo Pio della Pietà at Bergamo's Podestà Palace, that was essentially also at that point the Venetian governor's palace in Bergamo. Today it hosts a library, the library of Bergamo. And this is also interesting because you see how a previous sort of universal office for Italian communes now was basically occupied by a foreign occupant, rather. The Podestas were normally foreign, in this case Venetian in Bergamo, but in a more stable sort of territorial continuity, political continuity as well. This was thanks to Colleoni, who endowed 2,000 ducats annually for dowries to legitimate impoverished Bergamasque maidens. This stuff was very common in the late Middle Ages. This Pius works, sort of essentially insurance system based also on alms, etc. Plus, Colleoni established a vast inventory of real estate, residences, jurisdictional rights, perpetual rents, tolls, and water rights, administered by 5 trustees elected by the Council of Elders, one required to be a Colleoni, by the way. And the institution still exists as the Colleoni Foundation, interestingly enough. We're seeing even hydraulic initiatives enhancing irrigation across the central Bergamasque plain. Lombardy was dramatically advanced, was actually the most technologically advanced country in Europe at the time, had a very old history of land exploitation, cultivated specialized crops and more. Like, we talked about Milanese history, but we can't stress enough how overwhelmingly rich, just like today in Europe it still is, and from those very times. Colleoni's work witnessed to the enlargement of the Serio River intakes at Seriate that essentially fed the so-called Roggia Colleonesca serving Cavernago. These are all structures that Colleoni was using probably also to fortify his possessions. A 1468 compact with the Morlana company spawned Roger Curnan and a second Colleonesca center. The 1473 purchase of the Roggia Pedrenga named Borgogna, that it was like Burgundy, serviced eastern districts of this broader dominion. Unrealized schemes comprised also a Brembo-derived canal network for the aforementioned Isle of the Bergamasque. This was licensed in 1462. The Milanese, the Duchy of Milan, by the way, was creating something enormous in terms of bridges, canals. So this is in the wake of that broader Lombard expansion of the era. Even a navigable Brembo-Seriopol linkage that was approved in 1493. Colleoni was dead, but he had started that himself, and on the basis of his work. Remember, these men were very much aware of military engineer logistics, so they knew very well how to do all of this. And we've seen, for example, in the Battle of Caravaggio, even more than Molinella, how important the field fortifications really were. So it's artillery, right, etc. Even an Endine-Iseo-Adda connection, which is an incredibly complex work across sort of the pre-Alps, it's really fascinating. Conceded on November 26, 1469, Colleoni revitalized Trescore Balneario's abandoned thermal baths. These were ancient Roman springs that are still in use as such. And so just look at this Lombard continuity is very interesting. Malpaga's reconstruction, likely directed by Bartolomeo da Cremona, that was a military engineer who also worked for the Sforza, incorporated Franco-Lombard fresco cycles. There was a strong French influence in Milan, including scenes of the Battle of Molinella. And in fact, I used in the video of the battle the very frescoes, and that I inserted also here, and that depict the same Colleoni, and they're beautiful. They're very vivid, very colorful, and very detailed, very, very accurate. If you want to look at what a condottiero there looked like, this full plate horse armor, it's Milanese style, Italian, with Milanese as synecdoche at that point, because the Lombards had by far the most advanced arms and armor industry in Europe. I made a video explicitly on that. Expressly on that, but at large, when you say this is Milanese versus Gothic, actually this could have been made in the same Brescia, for example, and not necessarily Milan for that matter. Nor was specifically even just the Milanese style at that point. It dominated, surely was the hegemonic one, but it was produced all over the peninsula and exported, as you know, also pretty far, especially in actually everywhere, right? But really. Also in England, in the Balkans, etc. There was by the way, also a reclamation of converted marshes into productive farmland master grounds adjacent to Malpaga. So enormous feats, actually. Colleoni, as a classical condottiero, was also very refined in tastes, in art. He has his variable court, as we've seen, and his patronage embraced the Basella Sanctuary near Urgnano, churches at Romano and Malpaga Martinengo's Incoronata Franciscan Monastery and Santa Chiara Convent for Clarisses, and the Trescore Baths, as we've seen, extolled in a treatise by the physician Ludovico Bugella called Lo Zimaglia. In Bergamo, Colleoni engaged Gian Mario Filelfo, famous humanist and son of Francesco, as public lecturer in 1471. The Colleoni chapel construction commenced in 1472, what you can still see in Bergamo. This happened under Alessio Agliardi, a canon of the Santa Maria Maggiore in Bergamo, necessitating, in fact, the demolition of the church's sacristy. In fact, if you really look, I use it part of that also in the thumbnail, you can literally see that this chapel is probably integrated into the church in a massively structural way, and the church is much older. So, what they did in the Renaissance would probably horrify us in terms especially of the destruction of medieval stuff, but, it was also a great feat of engineering at that point. And you have there also Amadeo's sculptural program unfinished at the moment of Colleoni's death. We probably realized that those were his last years anyway. The chapel was in fact completed only in the early 16th century and is now a UNESCO site. As we've seen, Molinella's malaria had enfeebled Colleoni, and he also grieved his wife Thisbe's daughter Medea. The latter had passed in 1470 at age 15, prompting temporary withdrawal and the embalming, by the way, of Medea's pet sparrow for joint interment. Just think, how these people lived, what kind of beliefs they had, what kind of symbols they were after, and what kind of marvelous existence they had. And this relation with that today, again, we didn't talk so much about warfare per se. We've mostly seen the political and military career of Colleoni, but this man had killed by his own hand hundreds of people. And so you have to imagine, how do you feel at that point with your own daughter's death when you have killed so many people? It's something you can't even begin to explain. But that probably made also a lot of sense in the broader picture. These people lived and felt, hated, loved them in ways that we can't quite achieve anymore, right? Colleoni surrendered command on May the 15th, 1475, alleging unpaid arrears and initiating demobilization of his troops. This is also very sad, if you think about it, for a man who had been fighting for 60 years with those standards. Venice spurned resignation, deploying 3 provveditori to audit finances and secure succession, anticipating inheritance exceeding 300,000 ducats in cash along extensive properties. The will of Colleoni mandated an equestrian statue in St. Mark's Square. Venice fulfilled the bequest partially, erecting Verrocchio's model cast by Alessandro Leopardi, completed in 1495 at the Camposanto Giovanni e Paolo. The statue, in fact, still stands in front of the Scuola Grande di San Marco. So it's one of the greatest masterpieces, as you know, in equestrian metal sculpture. It's enormous. Again, if you find that video about the condottieri, their art, they have a condottieri playlist. You should find that easily. This all, by the way, while reabsorbing 8 of 10 feuds and most liquid assets despite prior contractual guarantees. So Venice, again, very financially minded. She knows how to deal with stuff. Colleoni is old now and is withdrawing, so it's a matter of time before, in fact, he expired at Malpaga on November the 3rd, 1475. Some sources cite November the 2nd. This was not so important. Sometimes you have no idea what Renaissance historiography does, like just for editing a better original version, they changed the date. Once I said the 3, the other the 2 to say, but my one is original, kind of stuff like that. So different from my favorite time in the Middle Ages before. Colleoni was entombed amid pomp in the incomplete chapel. Lacking male progeny, 8 daughters, by the way, partitioned the estate. So, if you have 3 bulls, that may be the outcome for some reason. You have the legitimate Ursina, 1434-1475, Caterina, 1440-1500, Isotta, natural Medea, 1455-1470, as we've seen, Cassandra, 1459-1519, Polissena, Riccadonna, and Doratina. These were Colleoni's daughters. Loyal secretary Abbondio Longhi had accompanied Colleoni since 1454, witnessing to, also his passing. So what to say about Colleoni? When I make these videos, imagine having made 2,600 videos at this point in the channel's history and, arriving to the realization you still haven't made a single video about figures like Colleoni by specializing in medieval warfare by some degree. It's very difficult to sort of wrap things up because how do you describe this man? Colleoni, we haven't seen him. Today it's just a brief introduction, all right? It's just like looking at who he was. If you never really heard of him, bad, naturally, but, there is time to make up. Colleoni epitomized the transitional condottiero, to an extent at least, melding mercenary opportunism with professional permanence within Venice's institutionalizing framework. This is really the full mature moment of the Italian condotte, especially as independent Italian states, and or at least states that could compete like in international arena, and or at least could remain largely autonomous and trying to hegemonize the entire peninsula. In the video again about the Venetian army organization between the 14th and 15th century, you can see better how this mechanism worked. Also in the aforementioned video about Molinella, really, you can understand a lot from the era. Colleoni's tactical lexicon fused Sforza's velocity and ferocity with Braccio's prudence and discipline. It's a bit of a cliche because the idea, what was the story there? At some point I will make a video about this, the idea that there were two schools of condottiero warfare, mostly from a tactical point of view, the Sforzeschi and the Bracceschi after the early Sforza, Mozziatello, and Braccio da Montone. And so the idea that there was a more straightforward way of attacking, aggressing frontally, etc., another one based on treachery, ambush, harassment, all this kind of stuff. It's a myth, really. I personally don't think that was... surely these schools describe something real, but it's Clausewitzionally speaking, it's not like you have just... you don't understand much about warfare if you think that there is just a style of combat per se, right? These men were, by the way, at the time, the greatest commanders in condottiero Italy, and they knew perfectly well how to do the other guys' style at each moment, right? But ideally, there was this sense that it was almost like a matter of, it's like, I don't know, if you look at football players, you say, do you play more like this guy or that guy? Like for some reason, like they would have had this kind of divide. What this means about Colleoni is, however, that Italian armies had been stepping up further, right? After the sort of the generalized global crisis of the mid-14th century, the armies had actually shrunk in size. At this point, you really have, especially in the second half of the 15th century, really massive armies. Again, like at Molinella, at Caravaggio, tens of thousands for both sides, which was still rare, relatively rare in other countries in Europe that were also stepping up in that fashion. So in that sense, you can't compare really Colleoni's time with Braccio's. They're two different eras, all right? They're two different tempers. It doesn't render justice to either. And when you look at the history of these commanders, you always have to think that they sort of adapted to what was available, right? How many Napoleons, Hannibals existed at this point, but maybe, if they were born in countries that had sort of pretty small armies to begin with, or somewhere like where there were still tribes, they didn't have probably the means to do so. So Colleoni actually represents a mature, sort of competent regional scale commander that properly controlled like the Italian political and strategic balance at some point in his life. So we're talking something massively advanced, again, coveted by Charles the Bold, that had, together with Venice, the most advanced army of the era. So we're really looking at something very interesting and varied, that perhaps a more in-depth military history of Colleoni could better really show. A renowned Alpine specialist, as he also lived close to the Alps, Colleoni enforced rigorous order, eschewing the pillage endemic to his peers, and channeling martial gains into agrarian reform across feudal enclaves that constituted Venice's western rampart against Milan. This is interesting because there is a civilizational merit in this. Again, Colleoni probably, had it been in Braccio's times, because he lived through also Braccio's times to a degree, but say, had it been him, it probably would have been a bit darker, because it's more like a predatory type of warfare, the one of the end of 14th century. There's less to build. So Colleoni realizes that destroying resources in the moment is not useful anymore. You have enough surplus to start building rather than destroying. In fact, while, as we've seen from the Milanese voice, employer shifts invited perfidy charges, scrupulous contractual adherence preserved Colleoni's honor. In fact, he was considered, compared to Carmagnolo, it was literally put down, as we've seen, by the same Venetians for for treason, as it was completely normal, but a bit more, unbalanced than the usual. Colleoni maintained, he changed side as well, but say he maintained a coherence, a concept. Were always some kind of reasons for which he did that were evaluated. It was especially from the Venetian side that ended up, collecting his legacy, sort of explaining, at least motivating his behavior. In fact, no substantiated treachery proper stains Colleoni's record. He didn't simply pass while he was in service of a lord to another. He had, as we've seen, these commissions, these condottas, and at some point, he was, coveted by many, but at the end of the day, he switched sides, but when he was a free condottiero practically, regardless of all the ties they could have had in other sort of private, unofficial ways. Yearning for sovereign principality endured as well, yet pragmatic integration into Venetian structures defined Colleoni's archetype as this frontier condottiero feudatory, because that's what the Venetian army organization had come to, simply enthusing these major leaders together with their entire army so that they could basically integrate in properly the Venetian state to some degree. Not fully, but still, just to have a full army at disposal. And again, the Venetian one was the strongest in Italy at this point, under Colleoni, right? So, and Colleoni buttressed post-Lodi equilibrium while perpetually straining Republican treasury and tolerances at the same time. All this cost very much, and as we've seen, there were battles even after the League of Lodi, the Italic League. And this is really typical of the era. Really, it's all Italian history condensated in this dynamics in a strictly strategic sense. Colleoni's companies, by the way, persisted as Venetian Lanze Spezzate themselves for 30 years post-mortem. Broken lances because they had, in this case, lost their leader, right? And there was an enormous prestige attached to that. I mean, there were men again that had already fought for Colleoni when they were in their 20s, and that found themselves to be condotta commanders at the time of the hottest moment of the Italian wars in their 50s. And think about the honor, and think about how distant, ideally, it were just 30 years, but everything had changed in the world in ways that we can't even begin to understand. Maybe not so much up to that point, but say at least for Italy, the Italian wars, but much else had yet to come. These men lived to see those lucky ones like Colleoni that died at 80, which was definitely not usual for someone with that curriculum. They witnessed the Reformation, right? Just think this in another context, again, it's difficult to fully explain. There had been the Hussites, but it's like something way beyond in a fashion, and that's why I love these series, because these specials really allow you to tell the history of the entirety of Europe all across the board. They show you how everything interconnects. By studying Colleoni in this case, you can get so much also from the other countries. And what is really beautiful, and you have all the pictures here, is the Verrocchio monument. Andrea del Verrocchio, who gifted us with one of the masterpieces of, again, Renaissance equestrian statuary art. This monument stands in Venice as one of the most famous monuments, in fact, landmarks. And also Amedeo Chapel in Bergamo. These are the two major families. Colleoni's chapel is fantastic, as you've seen also in the pictures. And they really stand as enduring monuments to a career that bridged medieval chivalry and Renaissance statecraft. In this sense, really embodied the spirit of a time, of an era. And the strange thing, in a sense, is how we look at these times, and we say, well, more or less, I know what happened in the time in history, but just think about living in that, and that your time, your age is not even properly contemplated at the age of Colleoni. Is there such a thing, right? Well, in Italian warfare, definitely. And that's something you really want to take in consideration. So our condottieri content after years of neglect is rising. This is the 14th video about the condottieri. It's almost embarrassing, but we're adding more for sure, and there's so much to do, admittedly. But I'm glad we did what we did already. As you know, single videos go in multiple playlists. There is also the medieval Lombardy that has, this is the 21st, and again, I'm glad because in the last couple of years we made not too many videos about medieval Lombardy, but still something that is quite unique because nobody really discusses this on YouTube. And this is also Venetian stuff. So Venetian, let's see how much Venetian history is only 13 videos about Venice. Ouch, 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 ouch. And here we also have to fix the order of the videos because, wow, from this long, yeah, for more than a year, almost a year, this silly YouTube playlist at some point stop. You tell them to insert the new videos at the top, but after a while some switch and you upload the video and you find it at the bottom, people don't see the newer videos at the top. They're the best. So actually we should make especially more about Venice. Really must do something more and better. But there is also probably a continental dimension in Italian history that, because everybody knows the Italian maritime republics, at least most people think, even from video games, that Italy was primarily about maritime republic. It wasn't, right? It was mostly a continental force. And when you look especially at Milan, and the same Venice at this point with the terra firma state created to counter, in fact, the Ambrosians, well, you really appreciate this more. And so, again, it's incredibly interesting and important to make this videos. I hope it will really add to the whole picture. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.